Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to get started. We've got well over 200 of you logged in, which is fantastic. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Bait and Switch, Understanding Bill 23. We're referring to it as the More Sprawl, Fewer Wetlands Act. We'll also be speaking today to some of the recent changes that you've heard about around the Greenbelt and some of the other issues around municipal official plans and the Ford government. I'm going to start today with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm situated on at home here in Hamilton is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and it's directly adjacent to the Haldimand Tract, 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. That was returned to the Six Nations of the Grand River by the Haldimand Treaty of 1784. The larger territory of Southern Ontario is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and this is a really important covenant to reflect on today. This is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas that bound them to peacefully share the territory and to protect the land. The single spoon reflects the need to share and to ensure that the bowl is never empty. This refers to taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with. There are no knives, indicating the need to protect and to share in peace. Subsequent Indigenous nations and other peoples were invited into this covenant in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to gather on this territory, even virtually, and to work in this community. Through this land acknowledgement, my intent is to honor and to show gratitude to the original stewards of the land, as a sign of respect and willingness to learn and heal. And I'd encourage people, if they'd like to share the territory that they're sitting in, feel free to put that into the chat. Just want to add too today that as we learn and discuss the profoundly problematic changes that the Ford government intends to impose, I want to share the words of Chief Kelly LaRocca of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. Chief LaRocca has shared her nation's deep concerns about the fact that they are being, quote, willfully ignored by the Ford government. Her nation continues to push to protect the land and waterways in their territory. Together, may we care for this land and each other, being mindful of generations to come. Well, hello everyone. My name is Lynda Lukasik, and I'm the Executive Director of Environment Hamilton. My organization has played an integral role over many years now advocating for smart urban growth management and farmland and natural areas protection in Hamilton and beyond. We're a proud member of the Stop Sprawl Hamont movement, and I know that there are other Stop Sprawl Hamont members on the call today, and we succeeded in getting the city of Hamilton to freeze our urban boundary back in November of 2021. I have more to share on that later in the call today. It's not good, but we have lots to talk about today. So today the main focus is on Bill 23, and I'm just going to provide a very quick overview right now. Oh, sorry, just a bit of an overview on the session today. The panel discussion that we have organized will last about 30 minutes. We've got some questions that we'll be directing to our expert panelists, and there will be some time, hopefully, for the audience to ask some questions. We're asking you today to please use the Q&A feature that you'll find on the bottom of the screen. Really important that you put your questions there. We don't want them to get lost in the chat. And then we'll wrap up today with some advice and direction on what you can all do to help to push back on Bill 23 and everything else that's happening right now in Ontario. So I'd just like to start right now with just a really high level overview of the bill. Just so you're all, and I'm sure a lot of you have been looking into this, it's referred to as the More Homes Built Faster Act. The bill is really going to bring in a whole lot of problematic changes. You see some of them on the screen here. Facilitation of the sale of conservation lands without oversight. This is hugely problematic. We're going to see powers stripped from conservation authorities. So for instance, if there's an approval granted under the Planning Act, it could supersede any requirement for a conservation authority to issue permits. We're going to see removal of protections from precious natural heritage features, a whole lot of concern about the fate of green development standards. So there are municipalities who have these in place already and others on the brink of developing them, and it's going to create a whole lot of issues with making that happen. I also want to highlight that there are huge concerns for vulnerable Ontarians People who are looking for more affordable housing. We're seeing changes to the inclusionary zoning policy that would really cap out at a small percentage the amount of housing that the private market developers would be required to provide. Lots of concerns about demolition and elimination of requirements to replace affordable rental units in that process. So in addition to the environmental impacts, a whole lot of impacts for vulnerable Ontarians and any effort to keep rental housing accessible and affordable. Finally, you can see the final bullet here that refers to imposing farm meeting sprawl on municipalities like Hamilton, Halton, and Waterloo. Municipalities that very intentionally chose to head in a different direction, in a more climate resilient, inclusive direction. So this is just problematic on so many levels, and it's a whole lot of reason for us to be concerned. So that's a lot to take in. That's a high level sort of overview, but I want to shift now into introducing our expert panelists today, and they're going to delve into the details with all of us around these changes and the implications on the ground. We have joining us today Dr. Anne Bell with Ontario Nature, and Anne has been directing Ontario Nature's conservation and education programs for over 15 years. Anne holds a Ph.D. in environmental studies, and she brings over 30 years of experience working as an environmental educator, researcher, and an advocate. She represents Ontario Nature on the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance Steering Committee and as part of the Yours to Protect Collaborative. And Anne's expertise in natural areas protection policy, especially wetlands policy, has been incredibly valuable in provincial environmental networks. We also have Phil Pothen with us today, and Phil is the Ontario Environment Program Manager at Environmental Defence. He's a land use planning and environmental lawyer with a background in landscape ecology, landscape architecture, and 10 years of experience advising and representing provincial policymakers, select small builders, and concerned residents. And Phil has really played an essential role in advising and supporting many of us who have been fighting for smart urban growth management in our communities. Okay, so we're going to start to shift into the panel discussion. Just as a bit of a segue, I just want to share a little bit more from me in a Hamilton context. This webinar was pulled together to respond to Bill 23. But since late Friday, we found ourselves facing not just the horrible elements of the bill, but a Ford government proposal to expand urban areas into the Greenbelt, and Ford government decisions to undo those progressive efforts to see official plans in a number of municipalities that are truly climate resilient and inclusive. So for me, from the city of Hamilton, I can tell you we're all reeling in shock, and we're starting to mobilize because we've gone from a firm urban boundary plan that was already starting to work, by the way, because we were seeing significant trends in the municipality moving us towards more efficient use of urban land. So the market has already been responding in a positive way, even before this official plan became official and was implemented. Just as a for instance, over the last 5 years, we've seen a 40% reduction in the demand for single and semi-detached homes, so more efficient use of our urban land. So what the Ford government has done to us, despite a solid and compliant plan, is that they've overruled the plan and they've imposed an urban boundary expansion that's even larger than what the city had even contemplated. They're imposing a whopping 2,200 hectare, that's 5,436 acres worth of expansion on us. We don't have enough white belt lands. That's the rural land wedged between where urban Hamilton ends and the Greenbelt begins. So they're proposing to blow our boundaries out into the Greenbelt in 3 different locations in Hamilton to bring in an additional almost 1,000 hectares of land. And my question is why? Who will benefit? We know this move will not help us to build a climate resilient, inclusive future for Hamilton. It's going to make us more climate vulnerable. And it will not help us to provide more deeply affordable and even modestly affordable housing. We had a better, more cost-effective plan for all that the Ford government has quashed. And needless to say, we're fighting that. This isn't over. We've started to mobilize. We had a fantastic rally yesterday in front of Conservative MPP Neil Lumsden's office. And I just want to finish before I hand it over to the panelists by saying that we can't lose sight of the fact that all of this is happening within the context of COP27 meetings. And I just want to briefly read this dire message that I saw on Twitter today from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He says, I've just warned global leaders at COP27, we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. Our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We need urgent climate action. All right, so with all of that off my chest, I'm going to direct my first question to our expert panelists. Anne and Phil, can you share with all of us what your top 3 concerns are with Bill 23 based on the work that you do? And Anne, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lynda, and hello everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I see we have 433 people joined so far, which I think is a really clear sign of how upset and outraged we all are. So thanks so much for being here to participate in a discussion about what's going on today. Now, so my top 3 concerns, I think that's where I'm supposed to start. And, you know, of course, Bill 23 and all of the associated policy proposals, it's really big, and the implications are profound and they are devastating. So to focus in on 3 is a bit of a challenge, but here they are. For me, top concern is the fact that the bill overrides democratic process. So our right to hear about, so right to notification about planning proposals, gone. Our right to appeal planning decisions, gone. So those 2 very basic rights, the right to know and the right to appeal, are being removed with Bill 23. Second, the renewed attack on conservation authorities. We've been through this once before. Who knew there was anything left that they could tear apart? But here we go. Conservation authorities are being stripped of powers to be involved in permitting and to be involved in reviewing planning applications. So, you know, it's quite unbelievable. They're going to be prohibited from entering into agreements with municipalities about a broad suite of planning matters. So that means that all of us, our municipalities and the rest of us, we're going to be deprived of the expertise and the role that they play in coordinating planning and decision making across jurisdictional borders. And third is the threat to wetlands and natural heritage. So it's interesting. In addition to Bill 23, there are several postings, all part of the government's Housing Supply Action Plan. So it's especially for the natural heritage part, some especially concerning things happening in policy proposals. For those who are familiar with the provincial policy statement, for example, the proposal is, well, it's called streamlining, but what might actually happen is there might be no more provincial policy statement. There's going to be some sort of an integration. We don't know what it is, integration with the growth plan, but the protections that are provided through the provincial policy statement for farmland and natural heritage are all at risk. So those are my top 3. Phil, go ahead.
Sure. So I just kind of, I wanted to say, I mean, some effect of the top 3 concerns that I'm going to raise is that Bill 23 will build fewer homes, not more homes, build them more expensively, and in a much more environmentally destructive way. So, you know, I come to this from a land use planning point of view, and I'm looking at, you know, the environmental impacts of these land use planning changes. Anne has already talked about the attack on conservation authorities, but the other big piece is destroying regional planning as a process. So right now, we have a system where regional governments, if they choose to do the right thing, they can allocate growth to places where it can actually be serviced efficiently, where it actually uses existing infrastructure, and where it doesn't squander land needlessly, which means that they can impose, you know, density requirements, et cetera, that make sure that it can eventually be serviced in a cost-effective way. The government is destroying that whole system by causing a race to the bottom among lower tier municipalities. So you have every little village and town that's part of a region, like let's say Durham, or you know, a place like Simcoe County. They will now no longer have a top-level planning decision at all about where that development needs to go. They will all be able to compete with one another and squabble and race to open up as much land as they can. And this means, we know what this means. There's a reason why we have regional planning. When that happens, it means you waste a lot of construction resources, you waste a lot of infrastructure, and homes get more expensive and you get fewer of them, not more. Secondly, the measures that the government passed off as, in its Board of Trade speech is the main thrust of the bill, which was creating more housing in existing neighborhoods, are a huge watering down compared to what environmental organizations and housing supply advocates were asking for with one voice for a long time. That means, for example, we called for getting rid of exclusionary zoning. The government is not proposing to get rid of exclusionary zoning. They're proposing very tepid changes that, by their own admission, would only create 50,000 granny suites or modest small apartments attached to existing homes within the next 10 years. That's out of 1.5 million total homes. What we asked for is an overhaul of existing neighborhood zoning so that that can be the main focus of new family home creation. They haven't delivered on that at all. So, and instead, what they've done is they've actually erased measures that are required to, this is the third point, to allow other forms of densification, like taller apartment buildings, et cetera, to be done without harm. So one of the big pieces is they're trying to remove something called rental replacement, which requires that if you demolish existing apartment buildings, the former tenants can come back into the new building and continue their lease without disruption and without having to pay enhanced rent. So this means that there's actually going to be much more public opposition when we do get, proposals for density around transit stations. And all of the reassurances that we had that when density would happen, it would be accompanied by expanded park infrastructure, expanded social services infrastructure. The mechanisms for providing that infrastructure have been swept away. So what we're actually going to see is a much rougher reaction every time development is proposed within existing neighborhoods, and a sort of a paving of the way, literally and figuratively, for development in sprawl. So we're going to see expensive homes put in the most environmentally destructive places, and a lot of our constrained resource supply concentrated in, squandered on that rather than homes in the neighborhoods where they're needed.
Thank you, both of you, for sharing all of those additional details. It's, the more I hear about the details, the worse I realize it is. So here's the next question for you. Can you maybe take a deeper dive, both of you, in helping us to understand what's happening to conservation authorities, what the implications are for them? And Anne, maybe if you want to start first again.
Sure, thanks, Lynda. So I think as everybody appreciates, watershed planning, that watershed perspective is the hallmark, is the strength of our conservation authorities. It's quite unique, and it's the envy of jurisdictions across North America. Now, conservation authorities, they bring a sort of this ecologically meaningful perspective to planning and decision making, because it's based on that holistic understanding of watersheds rather than on political boundaries. So with the proposed changes to the Planning Act and the Conservation Authorities Act, the role of conservation authorities in planning will be severely diminished. And instead of the watershed perspective, we're going to have the perspective of over 400 separate municipalities, very, very piecemeal. And these municipalities, even if they won't be able to benefit from that watershed perspective of the conservation authorities, because they won't be allowed to enter into agreements. So, this is on top of what Phil just described about what's happening to that regional municipal planning level. So we're losing that, and we're also losing that watershed perspective on planning decisions. Pass it to Phil.
Sure. So, I mean, the big points that I would look at here is the removal of requirement for conservation authority approval for any development that's approved under the Planning Act. That sounds very technical, but almost anything you can think of that would completely destroy a wetland or forest, that is something approved under the Planning Act. For example, a new subdivision would have to be approved under the Planning Act. The kind of warehouse facility that was proposed on the Lower Duffins Creek wetland would have to be approved under the Planning Act. So when that happens, according to this bill, there's no requirement for the Conservation Authority to sign off and confirm that it won't be destroying a wetland, that it won't cause flooding or landslides. And moreover, the bill includes a gag provision, which means that those conservation authorities can't enter into deals with municipalities to actually at least tell the municipal governments that have that decision-making power what the risk is. So the government is intentionally blindfolding municipal governments so they will walk into these gaping cesspits of danger. And what we're going to get is massive flooding, massive landslides. And on top of that, even in the small sliver of authority that conservation authorities are left, they've been deprived of any power to do anything to protect land in general or to prevent pollution. All they can look at is activities other than development that that cause flooding and landslides. So it's very, very narrow what's left to conservation authorities, and they have not done anything, and there is no proposal to do anything that would fill the gap, which means it's just a wide open, unprotected net for the worst kinds of sprawl developers to score on and pave wetlands and make decisions that will mean massive natural disasters 10, 15 years from now.
Oh my God, all of this within the context of a climate emergency. I think we all need to keep on saying that out loud. This is just, it's horrifying. I don't know how else to describe it. So here's the next question. Will this bill actually fix the housing crisis? I mean, this is what the government claims this is all about. So Phil, did you want to start with a response to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely not. And it's not just us saying this as environmental activists. And to be clear, I'm not just saying it won't create affordable housing or attainable housing. I'm saying it will create fewer units. And you don't have to take my word for this. One of the lead spokespeople for an organization called More Neighbors Toronto, Bilal Akhtar, said it very clearly. This is the last thing that we should be doing if we want to create more homes. There are provisions like promoting density around transit stations and those modest measures that will be made for to facilitate more housing in existing neighborhoods. They're good, but they're outweighed by these huge attempts to grab pieces of the Greenbelt, to push sprawl out into large areas of farmland. All of these things mean that for each unit of housing, you're using a lot more construction labor, you're using a lot more materials, you're using more concrete, and those are all things that are constrained. And what the source of our housing supply crisis, because there is actually a shortage of housing, it's not that there isn't enough land available to build on. It's that we are squandering the limited supply of resources that we have on inefficient forms of development. The average size of a home in 1975, and I believe it's not a home, it's a single family house, in 1975 was around 1,050 square feet. The average size of a new house being built in Mississauga today is over 3,900 square feet. So that there is the crux of why we see so much construction, and yet we are not meeting demand for housing. So the only solution to the problem is to reallocate those resources, to use those existing plots of land that are being squandered on 4,000-foot McMansions for 4 modest homes, so that families that are looking for family-sized housing, a family-sized house was 1,050 square feet, they're not pushed out into sprawl. They can actually live in existing neighborhoods. That's the solution. That's what we ask the government to do. That's what housing supply activists ask the government to do. It's the same exact thing. And the government just ignored that did something that we all agree will not provide more housing. And I just want to just share a screen here. Even if we forget about the densification component and we look at just how much greenfield land is available, the area in gray and black is the only land that was used, that's been used to date. The black area is the area that we've used in the past 20 years or so. All the rest, the red has been sitting unused. That's existing greenfield land that hasn't been used. It's farmland that's already been allocated for development. And the orange area is also land outside of the Greenbelt. It shouldn't be used. There's no need to ever use it. There is no need to sprawl outwards even further in order to accommodate population growth. People don't want to live in those outlying areas. The shortage that we have is of housing in existing neighborhoods and built up areas. That's what we've got to deliver. And adding more land on top of this massive glut of unused greenfield land is not going to do anything to deliver more housing. Nothing at all.
Thank you for that, Phil. And I appreciate too that you're underscoring the fact that those outlying areas, I mean, they're car dependent, right? I mean, just exacerbates all of the challenges with the climate crisis. And maybe related to that, just in terms of impacts on natural areas. And I'm hoping you can share with us more about what the future looks like for wetlands and other natural heritage in Ontario if the Ford government persists and rams through these legislative changes.
Thanks, Lynda. Well, the future looks grim. It's actually quite depressing. We've already talked about reduced public participation, diminished powers of conservation authorities, and so on. And that means that the champions for nature at the local level and beyond will be silenced. And on top of this, protections for wetlands and natural heritage are being weakened. So I mentioned the provincial policy statement, and that's just part of the story. The government's also proposing drastic changes to Ontario's wetland evaluation system. Basically, it's being gutted. Experts are saying that in the future, we are unlikely to see many, if any, wetlands designated as provincially significant under the new rules. And even worse, those that are currently designated are likely to lose that designation. Many of them will be likely to lose that designation. I'm not going to go into the details of those changes, but I can if we have questions about it later. I guess, you know, for those who understand what that means, provincially significant wetlands enjoy a really high level of protection in Ontario. And so once they're no longer designated or they don't get to be designated, they don't enjoy that level of protection from development. Another really worrisome piece is the government's proposal to move forward with a natural heritage offsetting policy. So for those who aren't familiar with wetland or natural heritage offsetting, it involves extremely risky trade-offs where existing natural areas are opened up to development on the highly questionable premise that they can be recreated or restored elsewhere. So the loss is certain, while compensation is anything but guaranteed. In fact, in the United States, Canada and elsewhere, over 30 years of experience with this wetland offsetting stuff, there are hardly any examples of success. It is very, very seldom successful in fully compensating for the losses. That's the evidence. I think there are some situations where offsetting can be helpful, and that's when destruction is just unavoidable. Better to have something than nothing whatsoever. But offsetting should always, always be approached with the utmost caution and as a last resort. And I'm not sure that that's what the government has in mind here. Coupled with the law and policy changes that we're talking about, the very possibility of offsetting is likely to push the floodgates of destruction wide open. This is especially the case in the government's offsetting proposal because it includes what has been dubbed pay to slay fund. We went through pay to slay with species at risk. Now it's pay to slay for wetland offsetting. And what this fund would do is allow developers to destroy wetlands, woodlands, and other wildlife habitats as long as they pay into the fund. And when you stand to make millions, what could be easier than just cutting a check? So those are two of the big policy pieces that are going forward along with the changes to the provincial policy statement. It's really looking bad.
And just as a kind of a little follow-up to that, I mean, I'm part of ongoing litigation that Lynda's quite aware of in Hamilton that hangs on this issue, right? The problems with wetland offsetting, the fact that it doesn't actually function in any way to replace the ecological values of the site. And those are all things that are protected under the Conservation Authorities Act right now. And what we've heard, from the developers' side in almost a sort of gloating way, is that, if this legislation were passed, they basically withdraw their current application and come back and get the whole thing rubber stamped. So it's a real serious problem.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ann and Phil, for those responses. And, this is really, you think about, thinking into the future and future generations, and this is so short-sighted and profit-driven, and it's profit for a very small minority of the population of Ontario. This is just, we need to fight. We need to be fighting back. So my next question, I think, links to that. Could the two of you share with all of us, we've got this bill in front of us, what are the most important elements in the bill that really need to be changed here, that we really need to stop?
I'll jump in, Lynda.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in terms of the Bill 23 legislative changes, it's really important that the public retain the right to be notified and the right to appeal. If we can't be involved in land use planning decisions that affect our communities, who's gonna represent our interests? Especially, if conservation authorities are also cut out, then who will represent our interests in these decisions? And second, I think the vital role that conservation authorities play in planning decisions, that needs to be retained. So those two pieces of legislative change have me very concerned. As for the other policy proposals, as I mentioned, we don't know exactly what's in store for us. Well, we're pretty clear on what's in store for us for the wetland evaluation changes, because those are in track changes in the proposal. Really scary stuff. But we have an opportunity between now and December 30th, and the deadlines are different, but we have opportunities to comment on these policy proposals. And so we really do need to get organized and do that. So stay tuned for action alerts and so on in the upcoming weeks, because there's a lot moving forward very quickly, and there will be a lot for us to stand up about.
So from my point of view, I mean, there are two ways to look at this question. I think in terms of actual substantive impact and substantive harm that needs to be avoided, I think the biggest pieces of this legislation that need to be removed are the removal of the requirement for Conservation Authorities Act permits. Conservation authorities need to have the final word on those choices, and they need to continue to have their authority to protect ecological values and prevent pollution. So that's number one. That's in substantive value. And number two would be the changes to regional planning. They need to be stripped out. We need, coordinated regional planning, or else we are locked into decades and decades of high carbon emissions when we can't afford to do that. But that's looking at it from the biggest substantive impact on the whole regime. If we're looking at places where I'm optimistic that we might get part of the bill peeled off, and so there's actually a high return on investment in advocating. One of them is something that I haven't talked about, which is a piece of the legislation that would potentially inadvertently kill what are called green standards that municipalities implement. There is a provision to get rid of site planning as relates to exterior features of buildings. And this had, my analysis and the analysis of other lawyers is that this would kill what's called the Toronto Green Standard, which is a big piece of Toronto's plan to meet its carbon emissions reduction targets. And it's not clear that that was intended. So I think there's an opportunity for a carve out there to allow the green standard to survive, and for other municipalities' green standards to be implemented as well. And then the second piece where there's an opportunity is around, I think, the rental replacement, because we have really strong allies across social movements for maintaining rental replacement. Well, I think the most useful piece of information I can tell you here is what not to talk about. The stuff not to talk about is, don't complain that this is going to cause too much density, or complain about the loss of the ability to comment on housing in your neighborhood, or to oppose densification in your neighborhood. That is exactly the reaction that the government wants to provoke. It wants a torrent of comments that it can portray as NIMBYism, and then so that it can use that reaction against NIMBYism to distract from all the other stuff, which is the opposite of densification in neighborhoods. So really, people who live in low-rise single-attached neighborhoods, nothing in the bill about development in your neighborhood is a big deal, and that's almost part of the problem with the bill, right? It's the stuff, it's the sprawl in rural areas that's the big problem, and there's no, that's really got to be the focus. The more you just focus on it, this is a bill to promote sprawl.
Thank you, both of you, for that input on the bill, and hopefully people who are listening are taking notes, so that when we get to the take action phase, you've got some food for thought that you can integrate into any next steps that you take. I think it's fair to say that we've got fundamentally important frameworks that were designed to protect natural features that have been eroded away in one fell swoop, and we really need to be concerned about that too. All right, now on to the next depressing topic. Want to give both of you a chance to speak to how does all of this relate to the Greenbelt changes that were announced just this past Friday? So the massive taking out of chunks, or land swap, as the Ford government is calling it. And I don't know Phil, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I'm just going to share this image again, and I'll go to the previous one as well. So under any kind of sensible smart growth planning regime, or any regime that was making any effort at all to develop land in an efficient pattern or make efficient use of land to lower the cost of housing, there would be no prospect at all of anyone ever bumping up against the Greenbelt within the next 30 years. The land that's identified in red, that's already open for development. It was already open for development before this government took power. Compare that with the land that was used over the last 20 years, which is the area in black, right? It was actually 18 years, but so we're talking now about housing over the next decade. The government is talking about supercharging housing within the next decade. Within the next decade, there is no prospect of even eating through the land that is in red, that is already open. In fact, that land in red is enough to meet all of our land needs for the next 30 years. The land in orange is the highest possible estimate of what even the most sprawly developer thought might be necessary under the old planning regime. To go beyond that, to go and say that you need to start eating into the Greenbelt in order to meet housing demand, you would have to be purposely wasting land, purposely putting development in places where it will be car dependent. You have to toss out any attempt to develop in a cost-effective or responsible way. The Greenbelt attacks are an indication that that's exactly what the government intends to do. And just to be clear, serving up chunks of the Greenbelt, here it's around 7,400 acres of the Greenbelt. It's not just about those 7,400 acres. That is a death sentence for the entire concept of the Greenbelt, for the Greenbelt regime. The Greenbelt, once you put land in the Greenbelt, it is supposed to be permanently off limits for development. That's what allows landowners and tenant farmers to manage that land in a way that doesn't destroy habitat, that doesn't destroy the soil itself. It forces them to become cash croppers because they don't know that any long-term choices they make to protect the land are ever going to pay off because the land could be developed at any moment. So it destroys the habitat and agricultural value of the Greenbelt. But secondly, the idea that you can rip land out of the Greenbelt in places where people want it for development and simply add it on elsewhere is completely backwards. The Greenbelt is not a repository of all the land that we ever need to have in order to feed ourselves or to protect ecological values. The Greenbelt is like a shield that protects the most threatened sections of our agricultural land from development. The Greenbelt is necessary precisely because the Greenbelt consists of land that would otherwise be desirable for development. So the idea that we can remove chunks of land that are desirable for development and add chunks of land that aren't desired for development, you're not protecting land anymore. The Greenbelt concept would be dead. So this is and it's directly linked to the planning changes the government is proposing in Bill 28.
Thanks for that, Phil. And I don't know if you want to weigh in on the Greenbelt piece.
I'll just say a couple of things. Thanks, Lynda.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, obviously it's part of the pattern, right? The overall undoing of environmental protections. It is also a really nasty example of offsetting because they're trying to convince everybody that it's okay because we're only taking out 7,400 acres and replacing it with more than that. But it's not more than that. It's not more than that at all because a lot of the land that they say they're replacing it with is the stuff they promised last time we had a Greenbelt expansion announcement. It's not new. It's old stuff. It's not really being added. It's part of their old promise. Have they not protected it yet? Well, that should be another alarm bell. When are they ever going to protect the things that they said they were going to protect last time? Don't bring it forward now as if it's something new to be added as an offset because it isn't. Also, you know, it's just another one of those examples of the government not listening to experts, not even listening to its own experts. The Housing Affordability Task Force said that a shortage of land isn't the cause of the problem. Land is available both inside the existing built-up areas and on undeveloped land outside the greenbelts. Most of the solution must come from densification. Greenbelts and other environmentally sensitive areas must be protected, and farms provide food and food security. What do they not understand about that basic message from their own experts in a report that they commissioned earlier this year?
That's a good question. That's for sure. I think we're all wondering, how is it that, you know, the players, including municipalities that have tried to head in the right direction, are now being beaten down for all of that positive work and positive effort. It's incredibly frustrating. Now, I know we want to have time. We've got a whole lot of questions in the Q&A, but I want to just throw this question out there. Maybe we can start on it and then jump into some questions from attendees on the call today, because I know a lot of us are thinking about this. How do we bring it all together and bring together all the different ways that Ontarians are frustrated with this government right now? And Phil, maybe the two of you want to weigh in a little bit on this one before we shift over to questions from the audience.
Well, this is a game plan the government's been using for a long time. They've tried to use a lot of piecemeal measures in different places and make them look like all different things. What we are seeing, you know, whether it's the attack on the teachers, whether it's the attack on the Greenbelt, or not the teachers, whether it's the attack on the education workers, whether it's the attack on the Greenbelt, whether it's the attack on regional planning, whether it's the rejection of the smart growth plans in Hamilton and Halton, it's all part of essentially an attack on the shared values that kind of are fundamental to Ontario, right? We have a freedom of association. We don't needlessly waste habitat. We protect the future generations by not allowing incursion into wetlands. These are kind of the moral framework or norms that Ontario has. And the government is trying to just attack them all at once and sweep them out of the way far enough from the election so that it hopes that we'll all forget about it. So I think if we treat this as a single conceptually unified action, then I think we can support each other, and maybe we'll find that rather than distracting us, what the government has really done is make a really stupid decision and open up an Eastern Front that is going to get it, it's going to get it defeated.
Thanks for that, Phil. Anne, did you want to add anything in terms of movement forward?
No, just just to reiterate the importance of looking across sectors, seeing who we can align ourselves with. It's so important. It's always important, but especially important at this time.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add here, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call are doing this already, but get out there with the education workers, march with them, share with them. I was on the picket line in my neighborhood on Friday, over near Eastgate Square in Hamilton, and had a chance to talk to some education workers about the concerns that we have about Bill 23, and that we're standing in solidarity with them and with workers, and helping to uphold the rights of workers. So I think that kind of approach is really important. And I'm going to add too, it's looking as though, just depending on what happens with talks between CUPE and the government this week, there's going to be a massive rally at Queen's Park on Saturday. So there's another opportunity, I think, for all of us to mobilize and to help to amplify the importance of those commonalities that Phil has outlined so well, that we do all need to be coming together in solidarity and pushing for our shared vision of what this province has to be and should be, and what we all want to see happen on the ground. So we're going to now maybe take some questions that have been entered into the Q&A, and we've got Matthew from Environmental Defense supporting us on that front. So Matthew, I'm hoping you can help me out. Okay, and I do see a message from him, so I'm just going to read here what he shared with me, saying there are lots of questions on the powers of municipalities and conservation authorities. What powers are retained by CAs seems to be one question that's been asked a lot. So Anne and Phil, did you want to start responding there? And that question goes on to say, can municipalities take on these roles? How would that work? So I wonder if the two of you want to start with that one.
I could just, the last part of the question is the concerning part again, and that all municipalities can't take on those roles. Municipalities, many of them are very limited in terms of their staffing and expertise. Lots of them don't even have planning departments. They can't take on that role. So what does that mean? Who's going to be informing the decisions of council?
So, what you need to do is, I want to be prudent about what I say, because if the bill passes, it's going to be a huge mess, and we will have to press municipal governments to do everything that they can do to pick up the pieces. And that means that it will be necessary to, push municipal governments to create a whole new sets of bylaws that try to fill the gap. They will need to increase their property taxes in order to hire staff to fill this gap. And this means big property tax increases that are going to be required if you don't want to leave a big gap. So I'm talking big property tax increases to take over the role of conservation authorities, because the only way this can work is if municipalities just hire en masse huge numbers of staff that were currently with conservation authorities. And so otherwise it's not streamlining. It's very unlikely this is going to happen, right? Unless you have extremely progressive municipalities. Really, it's just going to be an empty net. On the green building standard, we've been working on potential workarounds. It's very clunky. It's probably going to make it much harder to develop things, but you could move some of them to zoning, conceivably, some of the elements that are done through site planning, but it's just much messier. There's no need for the government to do this. The only reason for the government to do this is just to enrich particular people who have bought. That's what all this is about. All of the big moves in this legislation, they're about particular people who have bought land dirt cheap, either because it's a wetland and could never properly be developed, or because it was in the Greenbelt and could never properly be developed. They bought the land dirt cheap. And the cumulative effect of these pieces of legislation is that those are all golden tickets now, right? This is a massive wealth increase through a bump up in the value of that land. That's really what's going on here. there's no other, there's no public interest purpose served by this.
Thank you for all of that and for that frank sort of explanation there, Phil, because I totally agree with you. And I would add too, I think we also need to recognize when it comes to municipalities, and municipal planning staff are already stretched incredibly thin, and that's been made worse by the Ford government with huge reductions in legislative timelines for reviewing planning applications and that sort of thing. So there's already pressure there that municipalities are scrambling with. So, this is, it's like they've taken away their ability to be agile and responsive, and in the hopes that if they eliminate these requirements through the CAs, that nobody's going to be able to respond. It's just the worst scenario we could imagine. So it feels like we've just got to fight so hard. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll through here because I know Matthew sent me another question. I've just got to find it in my long list here.
I popped it in again because I saw the
Oh,
chat.
did you?
It's
Okay,
busy.
thank you.
It's
Okay, here we
it's
go.
the same one I put in again.
Okay, so it's a question about, so it's with UNDRIP. How do UNDRIP and the rights of Indigenous peoples play in? Can the feds do something, anything here? And that's a great question.
To the extent that there is anything the feds can do, I'll keep my cards close to my chest right now.
And I don't know. I mean, obviously, UNDRIP and the rights that are within that document, they should be respected. Absolutely. And that's an interesting thing. It'll be interesting with the provincial policy statement, because there were some interesting additions to that last time around through input from Indigenous leaders, and whether that is going to be part of the new planning policy that comes out of this government, we don't know. But it is certainly one that should be mentioned in our comments about upholding it and maintaining it in whatever whatever comes down the pipe.
And again, I think you're seeing leaders from Indigenous communities expressing anger and concern about how the provincial government is proceeding with these changes. So definitely acknowledging that they're not being consulted as things are moving along here. Just problematic. There was another question about water quality. Water quality in Lake Ontario. So what are the implications of all of these changes for water quality in Lake Ontario? And then maybe an associated piece, and that is wildlife corridors.
Well, one of the things that's expressly stripped out of Conservation Authority powers is the power to deal with pollution and things that cause pollution. And one of the main kind of forms of pollution in Lake Ontario is eroded soil material associated with development, right? That changes the constituency of Lake Ontario. So this bill is directly aimed at removing the power of conservation authorities to mitigate pollution. And also the push towards sprawl is going to have a similar effect, because this mode of planning that the government wants to shift us towards means more asphalt, more road salt, more of all those sorts of forms of runoff related pollution.
Okay, thank you for those responses. So we've got about, here's another question, sorry. So I'm going to cover this question and then we're going to shift into some take action information that we'd like to share. So here's a question. What are the implications for municipal costs, servicing more sprawl, dismissing regional planners, hiring natural heritage staff to replace CA roles, loss of development charges, etc.? So there's a lot there, but what are the sort of dollars and cents costs for municipalities and municipal taxpayers?
I'll repeat, in order to do this, you would need a massive increase in property taxes. That's what it melts down to. I mean, and to say a massive increase in property taxes, if the government does this, then you need to demand that your municipalities do implement that massive increase in property taxes. It won't be enough to fix all or even most of these problems, but it's absolutely necessary. So if this government passes this bill, municipalities just have to massively hike the property taxes in order to fund some mitigation of the harm that the government will be causing.
So Phil, are you saying that we would be subsidizing urban sprawl even more than we do already?
Well, certainly. I mean, subsidizing urban sprawl, there are also things that municipal governments can do in order to divert the demand for sprawl. So what this means is really, folks, like, you know, we've been making the move to being YIMBYs, pro densification as environmentalists. It is more important than ever that we get as many homes as possible built within existing built-up areas. Because if we get that right, what we can do, if there is no plausible need to ever go out into the Greenbelt or to go out and use up all of this white belt land that they want to open up. So if we can divert all of that housing demand away from those neighborhoods, away from that greenfield, by adding more family homes in our existing neighborhoods, we can actually take a chunk out of that sprawl. But that's also just another potential mode of action.
Thank you for that. Matthew, should I hand it over to you at this point so that you can walk people through some of the actions that that have been pulled together? Yeah.
Yeah, that
Thank
sounds
you
good.
to Ann and Phil for
Yeah, thank you,
your
Ann and Phil. But
wonderful
I'm gonna
responses.
ask you to do a little more work because there were a ton of
Okay.
really great questions that weren't
Yeah.
answered.
Okay,
So if you can
sure.
go into the Q&A box and use the type answer button, if there are any that you know the answers to, could you just type some answers? Because there were definitely more interesting questions than we had time to get to. But I'm gonna put something in the chat for everyone that will have some links here. And we're gonna try to take some action. So I also have a screen that I should be able to share about this. Wow. The Zoom thing has been mean to me. I'm trying to change tabs. Well, first of all, the one I put in the chat was a petition that we have that's already live. So if you haven't clicked it yet, click that petition link and sign it. It will email your MPP. There we go. Now I've got the right tab here. And share that with your friends, because we do think, like, if we saw in Bill 66, the government got a lot of feedback from people, and we believe that the MPPs were letting Doug Ford know that they were concerned. And as a result, he walked back components of it. So we do think there's possibility for changes in this bill if the MPPs, enough of them, are hearing from people. So as now I've got the slide up, but yeah, sign and share the active petition. And then MPPs' offices will sort of take a note and make a check mark on a big list if they get an automatic email, but they'll take more time to think about it if they get an actual phone call or a personal letter, or if you drop by in person. So look up your MPP, especially if you have a conservative MPP that is going to be part of the party in power. Let them know that you're concerned about this. And then the third thing you can do is submit comments to the Bill 23 committee hearings. There were a couple questions about this. So I think, and I would ask Phil, I guess, but the idea is that it's best if experts and organizations testify verbally at the committee hearings, but that everyone should be sending in written submissions, keeping in mind that the committee is composed of representatives from all parties. So you want sort of productive and professional comments rather than critical ones necessarily, but you do want to highlight that you're concerned and that you're following closely. Does that make sense about how people should handle committee hearings?
Yeah, and if you're nervous about doing a written submission, I mean, really, you know, you can say it in your own words, but you know, the key information and the key messages you can take from, you know, our releases. And the big thing is to really, you know, focus on the message that this will not create more housing and it's needlessly sacrificing the environment. Build on that, you know, and personalize it from there. But, you know, our releases are available in public. The other piece is, of course, that some of the horrible stuff that you've heard about, like the attack on the Greenbelt, the refusal to approve the smart growth plans in Hamilton, and this wetland offsetting business. These are policy changes that are posted on the environmental registry, which means they actually have a slightly longer time period for consultation. and they're not in any way a done deal. Like they haven't been moved. There's no step been taken to actually make them law. So you can advocate for those things separately in separate letters in response to the ERO, and it may be easier to get those changes dropped. The changes to the bill, the timeline is tighter. Consultations are coming up shorter within the next week or so.
Great to hear. Yeah, and yeah, as you see in the Stay Tuned, Ontario Nature is going to have an action alert coming out. There's going to be joint statements endorsed by the groups on this call, but also other environmental NGOs. And similarly for the ERO submissions. And we're hoping to do a photography campaign. So if you have in mind like a conservation land or a wetland in your area that you're concerned about, like take pictures of them, and we're going to be sharing those sort of on social media and probably through a website. We're just working out the logistics of that. So we do have a lot of things to do. But yeah, again, the top thing is to let your MPP know that you're concerned about this. And if you don't have a Conservative MPP, you can go to Steve Clark's office or Doug Ford. Yeah, and people are having trouble copying and pasting. I see. We will be sending all this out in a follow-up email as well.
Perfect. Yeah.
And the last thing is that the committee hearing comments are quite easy to do. I did it like yesterday while I was preparing the how to do it document. So it's not as intimidating as it might seem. You just click through an online form and then you just have one text box you can paste in a few key points. So it is worth doing, and it's not as intimidating as it seems if you just look at it from the government website. From the top end, it looks very complex, but once you start going through the things, there isn't actually that much to do. So we do encourage everyone to do that.
And our advocacy is not futile. I don't know if you've been in this webinar, but the government just backed down on Bill 28, the revocation of labor rights. They've agreed to withdraw that bill, and that's from the kind of mass mobilization that we're trying to use here. So we need to, they backed down once. We need to make it a habit, and let's push as hard as labor did and is doing on their issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And one last thing that I would add too is that, check out what's happening in your community, because in addition to these higher level campaigns, I think about Hamilton, we've got Environment Hamilton, Stop Sprawl Hamont, lots of organizations that are working to inform and engage people. So that's another great place to look for solidarity and support as you're figuring out how to respond to all of what's happening here. We need to keep on fighting for sure. I just want to say thank you to Anne and to Phil for all of the wonderful information that you've shared with us today through your knowledge and expertise. It's just so important that we all get ourselves informed. And thank you to Matthew as well, and Alan behind the scenes for some of the technical support today. And thank you to all of you today for taking time out to join us. We had a fantastic turnout today, and I think that's a really hopeful sign that we are getting mobilized. We are taking this seriously, and we're going to push back. So stay tuned, everyone, and keep on fighting.